There is a certain term in the car industry. It's not used very often, but when it is, it tends to dictate more than you might think. That term is commonly referred to as built in a shed. Often used in a derogatory way by people who lust after the newest $1 million showpiece from Maranello, it denotes a car company that consists of a group smaller than most extended families. Sometimes it's even literal, like with the Connaught team and their Type D single-head VR10 sports car that is, yes literally, being designed, developed, tested, and constructed in a shed in Britain. But back to the point, I credit one manufacturer with being the reason for this term's existence. The company is a relatively small British marquee that most people outside of Europe have never even heard of. A company responsible for the most vicious, the most violently extravagant, and the most viscerally beautiful cars out there. That company is Tvr, and this is my attempt at documenting this cult legend of a manufacturer, focusing on each individual defining model and their story. Let's get started. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Tvr had humble beginnings. The founder, Tvr Wilkinson, started his automotive journey in the car repair business in Beverly Grove in 1946. This would remain the home grounds of Tvr throughout its continued existence until 2013, when they moved to Whiteley. Later that next year, a fellow automotive enthusiast by the name of Jack Pickard joined Wilkinson, and this is where our story picks up pace. Originally going by the name of Trev Car Motors, this was quickly changed to the name we recognize today as Tvr Engineering. I will be referring to them simply as Tvr throughout the course of this essay. The very first original chassis that Wilkinson ever brought into the light was in 1949. It used the independent trailing arm style rear axle from a Morris 8, and the 1.1-liter side valve engine from a Ford van of all places. Later that year, it was sold to Trevor Wilkinson's cousin for the equivalent of nearly 10,000 British pounds in 2021 currency, when it was then crashed and broken up for parts. There were two following one-off race cars, known simply as Tvr No. 2 and Tvr No. 3. Both of the following cars were simply evolutions of Tvr No. 1, only with small changes such as minor suspension adjustments and a new 1.4-liter overhead valve engine used in Tvr No. 3 from an Austin A40 with a blistering 40 horsepower. In 1955, a futuristic space frame chassis was developed for Tvr's new car, simply named the Tvr Sports Saloon. This was Tvr's first attempt at a chassis as unique and challenging as the space frame, yet it was as good as the best. The space frame chassis would eventually become a staple of Tvr's philosophy for the rest of its existence. As was common practice at the time with post-war machines in Europe, it was sold as a kit using an Austin A40 as a base vehicle. Being a kit, it kept important elements such as the suspension system, the engine, and other elements from the humble Austin sedan. Fun fact, the Sports Saloon was actually the first car to see a Tvr badge, drawn and designed by a young art student and Wilkinson's friend, John Cookson. To bring attention to his brilliant new kit car, Wilkinson himself entered and raced the Sports Saloon in various motorsports events, such as the Morecambe Rally. All of the Sports Saloon chassis were built to order, made specifically for the customer's specifications. There were even instances of one car being fitted with a 1.5-liter BMC B-Series engine fitted to an MG MGA, and one chassis built to accommodate a customer's 2.5-liter Lee Francis engine that he already had. Jumping to 1958, you see the introduction of Tvr's first fully assembled production road car, the Grantura. As it finally saw showroom floors, this sleek and beautiful car did still have the British cuteness shared with nearly all British sports cars. When the Tvr Grantura was introduced, it could be optioned with one of Tvr's two-star engines, either the Austin A40's sportier inline-4, or Ford's more reliable inline-4 lifted from a Ford Coventry Climax van. It was produced until 1967, with 643 being made. Near the end of the model run, in Mark III guise, it could be ordered with the comparatively massive 1.8-liter BMW engine, finally giving the Tvr the power it needed to fight with the more mainstream sports cars. Soon after, Tvr underwent a big change behind closed doors. After the well-received Grantura helped establish the brand across the nation, In mid-1960, the Atchison-Hopton Company bought a controlling share in TVR Engineering. Before the end of the year, Hopton had appointed himself as chairman and renamed TVR Engineering to TVR Cars Limited. Between September 1961 and February 1962, the number of orders for cars rocketed, and most of the finished cars sold. After the Grand Tourer finished production and both Wilkinson and Pickard left the company, TVR branched out into its longest-running nameplate, the Griffith. In October 1963, they finally did what they would become known for: stuffing oversized motors into tiny cars. The original Griffith came equipped, which was used in cars such as the Ford Mustang and the first Australian Ford Falcon GT, the XR Falcon GT, known in the US as the Ford Fairmont. From quite a few perspectives, it looks a little disproportionate, like a Micro Machines car. It wasn't necessarily in an ugly way though. In fact, it gave it a certain charm. In late 1965, Arthur Lilly and his son Martin Lilly purchased 2,000 British pounds of assets of TVR. TVR Engineering Limited was then formed on 30th of November 1965 with Arthur as chairman. The first car sold under their new rule was the short-lived Trident. In one of the most extreme examples of TVR's incredibly unique design language, this car was incredibly ahead of its time. If it weren't for the wire-spoke wheels, you would think it was a product of the early 1980s. Or at least I would. The next car introduced was the Tvr Vixen. Unveiled at the British Motor Show in October 1967, it proved popular, and generated many new orders for cars. Encapsulated in the glass fiber body and sitting inside TVR's signature space frame chassis was a 1.6-liter Ford Kent engine, made possible by a certain racing legend and British staple, the Ford Lotus Cortina. To use up remaining supplies, the first 12 Vixens built still received the MGB engine. And now we see TVR getting into some trouble, to put it lightly. At the British International Motor Show of 1970, TVR hired model Helen Jones to pose nude on the TVR stand, and the resulting commotion immediately generated even more publicity for the company. This advertising technique was even used again at the 1971 show, when Helen Jones was accompanied by a second model, Susan Shaw. This reaction was even greater in 1971, and amid the vibrant response, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders almost banned TVR from the show. This, of course, drew even more attention to the marquee. TVR was quick to capitalize on this boost in recognition. During Christmas in 1970, TVR moved from its old, cramped facility to a 28,000 square foot Bristol Avenue factory that had been vacated by Nut Brown Limited, a manufacturer of kitchen items. The workforce was enthusiastic about the move, as the old factory had become inadequate for the number of people working and the rate of production, which had risen to almost 10 cars per week. Let's get back to those cars now. The replacement for the Vixen was the legendary M Series line. No, not M as in BMW's performance line, of course, but the brand's own brand new model line. Models ranged from the gorgeous TVR 2500M, 3000M, the entry-level 1600M, and the unique Time R, and the top-of-the-line 3000S model all the way through the late 1970s. A new engineering designer named Mike Bigland would design the chassis, which was superior in every way to the outgoing Vixen chassis. It was more rigid, which would prove both better safety and handling, hence why it survived for so long. Although not all was well at this point in time, as it seems to rarely be in the history of TVR. On the 3rd of January in 1975, a fire broke out in the TVR factory, likely caused by faulty wiring in a 3000M demonstration car. Several complete and nearly complete cars were destroyed. Soot and ash covered every surface, and the damage was estimated to be £200,000 in 1975's currency. The factory was repaired, of course, but it was a massive blow to the fragile British sports car company. If it weren't for the grace of God that they recovered, it's more than possible that TVR would have faded into the distance, not remembered as they are today. Afterwards, they picked themselves up quickly and started producing the all-new TVR Tasman line. It began testing in 1979 using the widely popular Ford Cologne V6. The Tasman line was the first of the TVR wedge cars, named such for reasons you could understand by peeking at one of the models even once. Long hoods, sharp noses, and very few, if any, subdued angles and lines. Sharpness was the name of the game. In my opinion, these are some of the poster cars for TVR. Some of their most recognizable models, save for the ones that featured in popular games such as Gran Turismo. These cars, in my opinion, embody the pinnacle of 1980s sports car design, each one sporting staggering performance numbers and light-on-its-toes handling to back up their vaporwave aesthetic looks. Truly legendary cars in the history of British car design, and even in design across the entirety of Europe. Transitioning into the 1990s, TVR went under the ownership of Peter Wheeler, which with his help would be what shot TVR into stardom. Wheeler instituted a transition from using the both naturally aspirated and forced induction V6s that had adorned many of their cars to big V8 engines. Their main engine base was the Rover V8, which was then modified to suit each TVR's special needs per application. The new engine was originally designed for the Griffith and Chimera models, but development took longer than expected and eventually became available in the Cerbera and the Tuscan race car. And then we find ourselves in the presence of perhaps TVR's most achievable model for aspiring owners, the S-Series. Offered with either V8 or inline-6 offerings, both Wheeler designs, it was meant to be in the Porsche Boxster of the lineup. It was meant to sell, and sell it did, which means now they can be had for relatively cheap. Good news for us in the lower 80%. After the incredible success of the S-Series, this is where we start to get into the most well-known TVR models stateside, as in the rest of the cars developed under Wheeler's ownership. Stellar cars such as the new and bold body designs of the Chimera, the Griffith, the Cerbera, the Tuscan, the Timora, the T350, the Typhoon, and the Sargeras. Now I can't just write a story about the history of TVR and not go into the histories of some of these models, so let's go ahead and get on with that. Let's start with the Griffith. The first generation Griffith utilized all of the money the S-Series brought in by using a 5-liter V8 completely designed in-house at TVR. Although the Griffith was almost identical to its inline-6 powered sister car, the Chimera, it had a different body design which was produced in much smaller numbers, making it the more desirable choice. The passion for these cars is so strong that there is still a TVR Griffith-only meeting in Europe that goes by the name of the Griffith Growl. The next car was the Cerbera, released in 1996. One of TVR's most popular cars, it came in both Speed 6 and Speed 8 guises, with an inline-6 or a V8 respectively. This car represented 3 firsts for the company. The first hardtop, the Griffith and the Chimera were both convertibles. The first 2+2, as TVRs were traditionally 2-seaters. And the first to be powered by TVR's own engine. Historically, TVR had purchased engines from mainstream manufacturers like Rover, Ford, and Triumph as previously stated. Do you think that here I would just go on to the next production car, right? Well, no. If you know anything about Wheeler-era TVR, you should recognize one certain concept car that never truly saw the light of day. It was named the Tvr Cerberus Speed 12. It was exactly what it sounded like, a super heavily modified TVR Cerbera, outfitted with nothing less than a 7.7-liter V12 engine, mounted to an old-school manual transmission. This car was intended to homologate TVR's GT1 racing car, but rule changes caused that to be put to a halt mid-season. More advanced, high-cost, purpose-built race cars such as the Porsche 911 GT1, Nissan R390, and the Toyota GT1, as well as the subsequent demise of the class in other championships, suddenly rendered the Speed 12 obsolete. In an interview, the owner of the company, Peter Wheeler of course, said that TVR had tried to record the car's power on an engine dyno separate from the chassis itself. The dyno's strength was rated at 1,000 horsepower, but the test resulted in the input shaft of the dynameter breaking. To get an approximate figure, TVR engineers took the engine apart and tested each bank of cylinders individually. The result was 480 horsepower per bank, resulting in a total rating of 960 horsepower theoretically. This was then detuned to 800 horsepower when the owner of the company drove one home and deemed it much too powerful. One by one they were dismantled and used as spares for the 12 race cars still competing in the British GT Championship. In August 2003, TVR placed an advert in Auto Trader for a TVR Cerberus Speed 12 registered as W112BHG. What TVR did was sell the one existing Speed 12 to an enthusiast of the TVR brand, and to my knowledge, the original owner still drives it today. TVR's most modern model and their last car in production before the second generation Griffith is the Sargeras. The Sargeras is possibly the most interesting modern looking car ever made. Similar to TVR of the 1990s and early 2000s, the Sargeras ignores the European Union guideline that all new cars should be fitted with ABS and at least front airbags, because Peter Wheeler believed that such devices promote overconfidence and risk the life of a driver in the event of a rollover, which TVRs are engineered to resist. TVR's only modern car is the second generation Griffith. Using a Ford Coyote V8 engine, this saw TVR's return to using engines from other producers. Designed by none other than Gordon Murray, equipped with a 6-speed manual, a near 50-50 weight distribution, and not to mention a 200-mile-per-hour top speed, this car could be responsible for saving TVR if enough sell. Also, as a side note, an incredible evolution of TVR's design language. And here is where we conclude our story. TVR has been a company shrouded in controversy, changing owners, threats, questionable marketing tactics, to the point where it seems like they've been somewhat cursed throughout their entire existence. But throughout this time, TVR's values have always stayed true, and their products, while not perfect, have always been at the top of the heap. Forget beans on toast. If Britain wants to be proud of something they've made, they deserve to be proud of TVR.